questions throughout the talk, and we will get to them towards the end of the session. You can also find us on YouTube streaming live, so if you prefer to watch it at your own pace, feel free to do so at our channel, Shuruq SHJ. As cities grow and the urban sprawl increases, people treasure spending time outdoors more and more, and connecting to nature is at the moment trending. So city planners are more aware of how the public realm can contribute directly towards the health and well-being of citizens. In addition, day by day, decision makers are realizing that landscape, when implemented carefully and correctly, is a fundamental part of the solution to certain issues such as climate change. Without further ado, allow me to welcome our participants to discuss landscape architecture. Mr. Simon Fraser, Principal at Hopkins Architecture, Mr. Rowan D'Arcy, Regional Studio Director at Aspect Studios, Mrs. Camelia Zal, the owner and lead designer at Camelia Landscape Design, and Mr. Sam Martin, Director at Exterior Architecture. So thank you all for joining us this session. Before we jump right to it, let's begin by briefly introducing yourself and the work that you've been doing. And ladies first, so let's start with Camelia.
Thank you. Yes, so I'm Camelia Bidzal. I've had my own company doing landscape architecture in the UAE now for 17, nearly 18 years. And I've done projects like Al Barari, which is an 80% landscape development, high-end development here in Dubai, and I specialize in high-end villas and boutique kind of commercial projects.
Thank you. Really nice to have you today. Mr. Simon?
Hello, good evening. I've been in Dubai as well, actually, in the UAE for about 18, 19 years. And I've been, very, honored to be selected for certain projects like DIFC Gate Village, and recently Expo 2020, all the thematic districts. And most recently, just finished Jebel Behais Geological Park and Museum in Sharjah. And of course, I've been involved in Sharjah in the Expo exhibition halls as well in Sharjah. So a number of projects, done a lot of work in the UAE, and yeah, it's been a very, very enjoyable period.
Great.
But I'm now in London right now, just in case.
That's a nice studio you're in.
Yeah. Well, it's my home studio.
Yeah. Rowan, if you can.
Everyone, yeah, my name is Rowan D'Arcy. I'm the MENA director for Aspect Studios. We're an Australian firm primarily, but now based in multiple locations around the world. I've been a landscape architect and designer for 14 years, and I've spent 8 of those in the Middle East. And I've worked on projects like the approach road to the Louvre and the overall landscape strategy for the cultural district as well in Abu Dhabi, among others. And yeah, I'm just really excited to be part of a landscape discussion here in the MENA region. I think it's a really valuable resource and a very valuable subject to discuss. So thanks for having me.
We're excited as well. Thank you for joining. Sam?
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm Sam Martin, Director of Exterior Architecture. So we're a London and Manchester based landscape architecture firm. We have some experience in the MENA region. I think more recently the Qatar Children's Museum we've been working on. And I think from our point of view, we're very excited because we have a lot of interest in how the landscape should resonate for people into the future. And I think fundamentally we need to be listening to everything that nature is telling us to do that job properly. So yeah, I look forward to today's discussion.
Great. So just picking it up from what you were saying, listening to nature, Rowan, I'll start with you. How do you perceive and approach the concept of biodiversity in the urban landscape?
Yeah, great question, I think. Well, look, first of all, I guess the definition of biodiversity is kind of the variability of living things and of ecosystems. And there's a kind of interconnectedness that goes with that. And I think it's significant because, especially now, when we're looking at resilience and how people are resilient, or how communities are resilient, but this speaks to the larger issue of biodiversity as well. How resilient an organism is does kind of depend on its diversity. So from our point of view as landscape architects, for Aspect Studios, it's enshrined in our purpose that we try to produce positive impacts on people and natural systems in enduring ways, and that's part of our overall purpose. And so, we get that opportunity through various different means. And one of the most interesting parts of it is that when you approach a site, you can have a baseline of biodiversity there, obviously, and that's the first thing, is how do you protect that? And we're talking about water, soil, planting. There's lots of different elements that landscape architecture integrates with and engages with. And the first step is really to understand what's there, and then to look to protect as much as possible as you can. And a good example of that would be, we've worked on a project in Abu Dhabi, a large linear park project, which I can't disclose the name of, unfortunately, but that was all about maintaining planting, maintaining the existing the existing situation as much as possible, and that would help with biodiversity. And then the next part of that is like augmentation or enhancement. And so how do we augment biodiversity in places? Usually by kind of biomimicry. We look at what's working, works, and we lean on kind of endemic or native or near native species, because they'll have less issues, less impacts on the environment, and also less requirements for chemical treatments, that kind of stuff, less pathogen. So that's important as well, thinking local, and how you can locally react to a local situation with local solutions. And then there's I guess in an urban scenario, there's the opportunity sometimes to create biodiversity from where there was nothing before. And I'm referring more to kind of living architecture and that kind of thing, where you're actually inserting new ecosystems into a place that maybe didn't exist before. So we kind of really subscribe to this idea, in general, that from an urban design point of view, it works from both macro and micro, this idea of kind of patches and corridors. So you can create large impacts by doing small pieces, but trying to create interconnection between them. So you can have communities, ecosystems existing in one place and trying to spread them across the city. By this mean, not everywhere needs to be green, not everywhere needs to be planted, not everywhere needs to be approached like this, but trying to create these habitats or places or throughout the city that you can have wildlife cover, flora and fauna can flourish, insects can flourish, this kind of thing. So I think that's important, and some good examples of where Aspect have done that recently. We worked on another large 500-hectare park in Riyadh City, and that was all about rewilding, rewilding the city. In that case, actually wilding the city, not through maximizing planting, actually by listening and responding to the environment that it's in, and trying to create a desert ecosystem or a through the introduction of water. So much can actually happen naturally, but also using native endemic species as much as possible through that. And then to the kind of micro, much smaller scale, our director Sharjah in Sydney even has his own green roof in his own house. So there's lots of different things we can do from the macro to the micro, to try and promote that biodiversity in an urban environment.
It's great to hear all these different examples that you were discussing, and then biomimicry and everything else, because sometimes for someone who is not really, or who does not have the knowledge about it, we would think, or they would think, that biodiversity is merely just introducing different species and things like that probably don't fit in a city or an urban environment. But it's a selective process actually to what can add value and what you wouldn't want, basically. So it's great to hear that. Thank you.
And also biodiversity, I think, just to close on that, like from my point of view, I think it's important as well that biodiversity sometimes isn't the things that you want. You know, you don't want a lot of flies. You don't want, you know, maybe you don't want a wasp's nest. Maybe you don't want some mosquitoes. But by chemically treating these things, we're actually damaging the very foundation of what nature is underpinned by. And that's a really important aspect of this, is that we need to look at ways of doing that, doing less to our surroundings and letting things live more. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Camelia, landscape architecture is a passion of yours, and you often speak also about the importance of sustainable landscape in particular. So tell us how your design methodology is when it comes to landscaping, especially in the desert climate.
Well, I've actually now obviously experienced, obviously with Al-Barari, I kind of experienced what we just discussed actually is implanting a totally new biodiversity of plant life with Al-Barari. And in that we have created an ecosystem and a microclimate. And obviously, yes, we're using, you know, TSE water, which is recycled water, and we've done whatever we can to lower water consumption. However, you know, the realism of it is that it is an unnatural landscape within a desert. So in one of my recent projects, which is Koa Canvas, I actually was asked by the client to specifically do a landscape that fitted the environment that the building was in. So it was such a different, it was nice to hear from a client, because they always seem to expect, which we all experience, they want a jungle or they want it very lush and green. And, you know, we are in a desert and we do need to be sustainable. Water is one of the scarcest resources we have on the world. So when I approached my design for Koa, I really just reflected our natural habitat and used indigenous. It's 80% indigenous. There's a few native, and there's like 2 adaptive types of plants, and then most of the trees are adaptive. But again, it allows you to utilize less water overall, which is my main concern now when I am planting any project, whether it's a villa where they do want lush landscape, or I'm given the opportunity to actually plant with indigenous plants. And what people are surprised at is how beautifully green it can be. And what a lovely environment you can actually create using indigenous and native plants. There's a preconceived idea that it's got to look literally like a desert for it to be a sustainable landscape. It doesn't have to be. The approach really is about now, I think, you know, I would say it's been a big move over the last 5 years internationally, that actually countries and landscape architectural practices are using more indigenous plants. It's not just, you know, us locally because we are in a desert and therefore more aware of it, but actually it's a movement that's been happening, you know, for a while internationally. And I think it's very important for all countries to be concentrating on, you know, strengthening their own ecosystems and ensuring there's a balance in that ecosystem, whether it's a new landscape going in or it's an existing landscape. And I think, you know, another aspect that's very important is that architects, landscape architects, urban designers, you know, art consultants, lighting, everybody should be working together from the beginning at a project, from conceptual, you know, and the ideas with the client, because together you can create something much more fitting to the environment that it's within. And there's a lot more ideas that can come through, especially with sustainability, by actually workshopping together. understanding what the MEP consultants need, understanding what the infrastructure consultant needs, and the landscape architects can actually work with them to produce, you know, a beautiful landscape that might recycle water, for example, but through the landscape. So I am very aware of the fact that, you know, I would love every client to use indigenous plants. And we do have some great little garden designers at the moment who are actually promoting that. But in general, it's actually very hard to push the idea. It's a re-education of clients, I think, that has to happen. And it's slowly happening. I think that everyone's starting to notice it a lot more.
Yeah, I think it is slowly happening. And once you see more and more projects, clients realize that there is actually a lot of beauty in these approaches. So that's great. One thing you were saying is, like, it doesn't have to look like a desert to be sustainable, which leads me to Simon. And your approach to the Jebel Buhais project in Sharjah, which is an amazing addition to Sharjah's great projects that have been happening. It has been recently opened, I think, a year ago.
Yeah.
So tell us about your role as an architect, and then your role as a director, as you called it.
Yeah, well, you know, I'm a director, but just as an architect. I think maybe you can see my screen.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a real challenge with Jebel Buhais because you know, you've really got to. We didn't want to touch the ground at all, really. We found this fantastic site we were asked to look at, and that was where the we were asked to look at positioning the buildings in around about this area here. And to what extent, I mean, you really don't want to touch this place because it's full of lovely fossils and things like this. So we had to work really carefully to prevent this idea that you start introducing planting or start to touch the ground in too strong a way. So the key thought here was to position the buildings. There's another sketch after this, I think. You know, either do you build into the earth, which was one of this early sketch here, and sit it into the earth, or the solution we went for in the end was to lift it above the ground and let the ground come underneath it, and you know, so that the wadi can overflow as well at certain times of the year, but also so you can feel that the buildings don't interfere with the ground so much. And we wanted to try and retain as much of this feeling and quality of in the space as even with the trails we introduced, so that and I'm talking as a non-landscape architect. I'm an architect, and I usually work with landscape architects as technical support for what I want to do, and I love working with different skilled people, but in this particular case I wanted to do something very much which I had in mind, which was really not to have any plants at all. And so just to finish off, I mean, we ended up with a building that was let me just get this side here, that just sat on the ground as lightly as possible, using prefabricated elements, all precast elements which were built off site using local companies. I mean, nothing was imported outside of the UAE for this work, and this is where the building sits on the land in as gentle a way as possible, so that you can wander up into the trails, back down again in a meandering way. But it's around these parts here, all the approach roads and things like this, we tried to make sure that we didn't really impose ourselves on the land as much as we could have done. Although I recently saw someone to put some plants over here. You know, people can't resist to introduce some planting into projects, but hopefully that was just for National Day. But yeah, we took a lot of time to try and not do very much, which sometimes takes a bit of an effort. So that's my point here, I suppose.
Yeah.
You know, I can talk about other projects, but I think for this one, I'm trying to say sometimes you need to try and concentrate on doing as little as possible.
Mm-hmm.
I'll leave it to the landscape specialists for this.
I've got to interrupt and say I actually really agree with what you're saying, because sometimes it can be too forced.
Yes.
Our natural environment is a desert.
Yeah.
And, you know, what the beauty of indigenous plants is that they die off and you think they're not there, and there'll be a rainfall and they will come back. So, you know, Jebel Buhais might look like this now, but when it rains, it might be a completely different story. And it's beautiful. Like, I think what you've done in terms of, you know, being sensitive to the landscape is also the terrain. It's not just about plants. So I think it's really important that people see that.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, I was just trying to add in a bit of contrast here, and I think you're totally right. It's those are good points. Yeah,
it's a contrast, and I feel it also celebrates the geology, which is exactly what this museum is about. So it celebrates.
Yeah, it's a real honor and a challenge when someone says, you know, build in this special area. And you know, you've really, I mean, I have to say, we went through about 30 different designs for this to make it as minimal as possible. But yes, I mean, we could get into the, you know, the detail of those steps down there and how those were done, and how the walkway approach is designed so that it you know, you're not creating steps up into the building or a large ramp to the side and things like this. But that's another whole aspect.
It's all about the details.
Yeah, well. Sometimes.
Thank you, Simon.
Yeah.
So
I'll stop sharing, shall I?
Thanks. Sam, we've seen many examples in which the community comes together and inspires change. And one example that comes to my mind is the Highline project, for example, which was set to be demolished, but then the community came together and actually they became in charge and enabled the creation of this dynamic space that even changed the economical aspect of the plot or the site itself. So I know that exterior architecture are all about co-designing. If you can give us an example in which it has been celebrated and the design was actually influenced by the people and for the people, that would be great.
Cool. Happy to do so. Just an interesting one. I'd like to just comment on Simon's previous project. I mean, we often get called in as landscape architects for landscape-led projects, and I would suggest that that is exactly what that was. So, as a landscape architect, I love to see the landscape being celebrated. So,
great.
Just landscape architects don't just plant plants. Just
of course.
To be clear.
Oh no, don't worry. Yeah, it's I fully understand that. Yeah.
Pretty important.
And we were speaking with some fantastic landscape architects here.
Brilliant. Okay, cool. So in terms of the, I think absolutely the Highline was a fantastic example of what I think fundamentally came out of a derelict piece of infrastructure, but the community managed to get together and empower themselves to get to decision makers and to get to the position where they're at now. Often when we get involved in projects, we are involved once someone's made a decision, whether that be a local authority or someone who's a developer. But what we like to try and do as landscape architects is get involved as much as possible at the ground and grassroots level. So this is just an example of a project which is in North London in Enfield, and it's an estate regeneration, Elmer Estate. And so that is existing residents that will be moved into new buildings, but in the process, they will need to go through a way in which you phase the building of the new buildings. They will then be moved out of their old buildings and they will be demolished. And in doing so, the process was going to take some very ground-hungry, widespread, low-rise buildings and make them somewhat denser and taller, but that freed up a lot more space at the ground. So in doing that, we worked with the community to find out that what they really wanted is more opportunity for play, and that's not just for children, but multi-generational. And in that process, we identified people within the community, so that was creating community champions. The community champions with us, with the local authority, then went to the council and then said, what we'd like to do is to try and take most of what we define play, which is locked in behind fences and so forth, out onto the street so everyone can participate. And what has since happened is the planning officers wrote against our decision to make the streets playable. The committee of elected officials voted for this to go through, and Enfield Council have since signed up to a World Playable Streets Accord. So I think just from the process of empowering people and what they really wanted and needed from their immediate environment has sort of led to a sort of wider implication and wider repercussions, if you like, for the local authority and therefore for other residents of Enfield as well. So, you know, I think there are many different ways of understanding how this might work, and this is very much a London specific case, but there are ways in which you can understand how the green space can be used if you're lucky enough to have it. But if you're in a position whereby you're about to rebuild or start again, like we were with Alma, then you can reimagine what that space could do. You can reimagine what you can use it for and who can use it. So the thing I think that we're quite proud of and trying to engender is that quality in terms of the design quality of a space should come through equality. So the equality of decision making, the equality of who is contributing to those decisions. So the more diverse the voice and the voice and range of voices, the better the solution. So that's just an example from me.
Thank you. Yeah, and honestly, this really empowers the community, and it makes, this is what it's supposed to be. You're supposed to design spaces that people want to use, and they will only want to use if you're including them or you're actually catering to their needs. So it's really a great example. And it was interesting to me to see that what they wanted was opportunity to play.
Yeah.
And how you've integrated that, which leads me to my next question about the concept of wild play. So Rowan, in Aspect Studios, you've worked a lot with this concept, and basically it will not only cater to a child's need to play, but it takes it further and creates inclusive spaces for children to soothe them, even mentally, to challenge them, increase their creativity, and also have a more intimate connection with nature. So maybe you can tell us more about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like I think, first of all, I preface it by saying, you know, this is much of this work has been done before I joined Aspect, so it's really the Aspect crew who've put this together. But the Sydney team in particular and the Melbourne teams have been really active in Australia with exactly this, and it's a key specialism for Aspect Studios is bespoke play areas, water play, free play, you know, wild play. So it's enshrined in our, and again, not going back to our purpose, is enshrined in that as well. We're here to create like places of delight, you know, places that challenge people, and that's what free play is really all about. I guess wild play, or you know, free play, let's call it wild play, is all about just creating opportunities for kids to interact with nature, through kind of unstructured play experiences. And I'll come back to that word, I guess, unstructured, in a second. But I mean, access to nature and green space is just linked to so many positive benefits, as you just kind of highlighted there. You know, it's decreased depression and anxiety. It can mean decreased obesity levels. And there's even recent studies that show that it can lead to higher levels of better outcomes for kind of cognitive learning, this kind of stuff. So, you know, nature at its core and being connected to it is very important. So just coming back to that word, structured and unstructured play. Like structured play, I'm kind of referring to your typical swing set kind of in behind a fence kind of play. That's absolutely not what wild play is about. Wild play is about the opposite of that to some degree. You can still have those experiences, but I mean, it's more about immersion in nature. And yeah, okay, this is a good example is probably if you go to, I could share my screen as well at the end of this. The Ian Potter Garden is a really good example of that.
It's great. Yeah, it's exactly what you've been referring to.
Well, this is Yegan Square, not quite. This is more of an urban. Actually, if I can just share my screen.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
This is one that came to my mind.
No worries. And I don't know if you can see my screen now.
Not yet.
Am I sharing? Screen?
Not yet.
Oh, sorry. Apologies. I wasn't actually sharing my screen.
Okay.
Typical. This shouldn't happen in this kind of environment, but anyway, it does. So this is a really good example. Like, this is the Ian Potter Wild Play Garden in Sydney in the Centennial Parks. And so this is just about immersing in this kids in nature, so that allowing them access to things that maybe they don't get in their own home place, that maybe they can't access in their own neighborhoods. But it's also about it being multi-generational, as Sam just talked about there, for all people to go, of all ages and abilities, to go and, you know, go into a hide and, you know, play with some rocks and some soil and some sticks. And I think the best analogy is, like, you know, I've got 2 kids of my own, 2 young girls. You just give them a stick and send them outside. Like, they'll make hours of fun out of that. You don't need to spend tons of money on a primary colored piece of play equipment, you know. It can be a rock, it could be some planks put together, and it's about access to challenge for kids as well. Being able to challenge themselves, being able to make cognitive decisions about risk is very important. Whether or not they want to, sorry, I'll scroll down here, which is some better images. You know, whether to take that decision, whether or not this is safe or not, giving them a safe space to do that, which allows some degree of risk, is very, very important for children's development. We know that well from looking at a lot of research lately that's come out about children's development. And put in the COVID era as well, it's super important that you can go to these places and be safely distanced from other people and not have to wipe and sanitize everything. This is about real interaction, getting your hands dirty. So, and I think that's, you know, that's a really healthy thing for kids to have. So if I just scroll down here, this was all about creating a series of spaces with various different activities, and some of it's slightly, you know, some of it's structured. There's still space for that, and some are completely wild. So, you know, not all play spaces need to be completely wild play. They can have elements of wild play. They can have a ditch or access to an area like this of whether it's planting or bamboo. And I think that's the key thing about, you know, about the sort of wild play and the wild play movement. You don't have to be a purist about it. You can just have bits of it, and a little bit is better than none. And kids will find a lot of this stuff themselves, and you'll find kids walking away from the structured play stuff and playing actually in the ditch, or you know, that will satisfy some of their core needs at that point in their development. So yeah, I think it's a very important part of play, is this wild play idea. But you know, there's lots of different links back to biodiversity. But really, we talked about educating kids, I think, a little while ago, or creating, you know, what we really want to do is create like environmental custodians. So create that connection to nature when people are young, and maybe they will understand then this interconnectedness, the biodiversity concept much easier, and then be able to become custodians of their own environments. I think that maybe talks to a little bit what Sam was talking about, of, you know, neighborhood inclusivity, of people being involved in decisions. That could also speak to this, but you know, I think it's something that's very positive for children's development.
It definitely is, and just like you said, there's risk, you know, involved, a little bit of it, but it teaches kids. There are so many challenges, and I feel like it also brings kids together in a way, rather than having, you know, different play areas that are designated towards a certain age or something, and then it's a swing and a slide, and the kid is playing on his or her own. This is more interactive, so it's really great to see that.
We'll also find better engagement means less vandalism, things like that. You know, if someone is challenged by something, they feel, and they use it all the time, that they'll feel ownership for that, for what it is that's giving them the thing that they need, and that will, in a community sense, protect it to a sense. You know, they will be the police for you. You know, nobody wants them to burn down the big rope swing if everyone's having fun on it. You know, like. Let's face it.
I think it's also important to know, you know, with playgrounds, because I also have just designed a natural play playground in Al Barari. I mean, we actually, you know, created some of it ourselves from some trees that had felled during the storms. And so I'm a big advocate for wild play, and also because I'm very hippie and my son goes to a Waldorf Steiner school where it's all about connecting children to nature through teaching. But I think it's what's fundamental is people need to realize this isn't something new. This is something that we are going back to because we have lost our connection with nature. And we all have that connection to nature because we're in the field for a reason, right? And, you know, there is a lack of understanding. People have lost, there's a couple of generations that have lost that connectivity. So, you know, yeah, you know, for us, it's very important to bring that connectivity back. And wild play is actually what we used to do as kids. I know, you know, was just, you know, your parents would open the doors, tell you to get out the house and come back at sunset, you know. But nowadays, obviously, things have changed in terms of safety and you know, other aspects. But as you said, Rowan, you know, a stick and a ball. I mean, one of the games that we have as Emiratis were literally with sticks and balls or like rings. It was all basic play. And there are now, you know, there's research has shown that you give children these normal, awful slides with stairs and a little bit here and there, 7 minutes is the average time children will spend on it. Whereas if you give them the new kind of style of wild play and of structures that are actually challenging the children, which means that they are using their brains, they're understanding their bodies, they're understanding their capabilities. So that it's like how we were when we were climbing trees. So we're kind of giving them an equivalent of climbing a tree, although I make my son climb trees. Well, I don't make him, he actually loves it. But like, you know, what we're doing is bringing that back. And I think, you know, it's great that I actually use that park as an inspiration, Rowan, because I just, you know, it's really important. It's really fundamental to society and community that we actually connect people back to nature.
Definitely, starting from kids, I believe, yeah, for sure. And I think, Rowan, you were also saying that these times, these areas are becoming very important. Now, you want kids to play outdoors because of what we're going through at the moment. You want them to still enjoy and all of this depression that happened, you know, during quarantine or something. You want them to release the energy. So, and that also brings me to my next question, which is to you, Camelia. Again, we've noticed the importance of green spaces and the connection, as we were saying, with nature and outdoors now, especially after everyone was at some point locked in their own home. So how would your design approach differ in the upcoming projects that you would be working on with all these lessons learned?
If I'm truthful, it's always been my job.
Okay.
That's what I'm here. That's I really, yeah. I'm emotionally driven as a designer. So for me, it's always been a purpose. There's been a purpose to what I do, and that's literally to connect people back to nature. So even if I'm just planting a couple of trees for someone, or I'm doing a residential, or I'm looking at a playground, or I'm looking, you know, just a terrace even. It's how can I give people that connectivity to nature that de-stresses them, that gives them the endorphins they need, that brings the happiness, that, you know, we are fundamentally connected to nature and we've forgotten that. We're a very small part of a much bigger picture. Sorry for being so hippie, but I really, you know, I think, you know, it's fundamental that we understand that we really are a very small part of a much bigger ecosystem. And therefore, it's our job, my job, to protect and serve and hopefully, you know, keep that balance going, because we're unfortunately losing the balance, and that's going to have a devastating effect on the whole ecosystem of the world. I'm not really fussed about humans, if I'm honest, because nature always comes back. So, you know, I think it's a real struggle between urbanization and sustainability, because now, and please don't take offense, Simon, now architects are suddenly going, oh, you know, we need more green in our cities, and we need more connectivity from, especially here in the UAE, from one area to the other, so people can actually walk in shade, in an environment that, you know, and trees are your best solution.
Yeah, I agree. No, I agree. I totally agree. It's walkable, walkable places. Walkable places is the key.
Exactly. And I see too many projects here with the afterthought of landscape.
Yeah. It's got to be there at the beginning. It's got to be there right at the beginning. I totally agree.
And we also have, you know, a lack of understanding of the benefits. Look, if you look at the reflective heat that we have in all these new urban high density areas now, especially here in Dubai, they're now wondering why some of them aren't working. Well, I can give you that answer.
Well, they should have thought about the spaces between, I suppose. Yeah,
exactly. And also, what brings community together?
Yeah.
It's little parks. It's where people can sit and hear water and
that's
talk,
right. Yeah,
or
totally.
have theatre or events and have multifunctional spaces. And that's the job of all of us consultants. That's why I'm saying it's got to be a multifaceted design from the concept.
Yeah.
And then you can create, the world's your oyster, honestly.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really well said.
Yeah. Camilla, I share your frustration. I mean, and as an architect myself, one of the things that I think about, and I hope that we sort of realize it and start correcting it. Just like you said, the concept of walkability. For me personally, I live in a residential neighborhood, but then it's all paved, and we know that usually you walk from home to the mosque, for example. There's a mosque in every neighborhood in Sharjah, and it's you know, it's best preferred that you walk and not take the car. And the least we can do is just design and plant trees so that these walkways are actually shaded.
Well, I would say it's actually a really good idea, but it's been a struggle, I must say, since I started working in the Middle East. For somehow those things get extracted from the building process because people want to make more efficient buildings. You know, the car dominates. It's really quite difficult to create developments that have that walkability, and it's been one of the key things we've been trying to do. You know, I mean, at Expo we were given a brief to create all these buildings, you know, about 100 buildings, and the first thing we said was you got to think about the spaces between and make it walkable, and also for legacy after Expo, it's got to be a livable community.
Maybe you can share a few photos.
Yeah, Simon? I mean, I've got I can share. I mean, I think one of the interesting things there that Camelia said, and she mentioned about you know, the trees. We had a difficulty of trying to create trees or shaded spaces between. Can you see that? And this was a sort of concept image of our project, was to say, well, how can you create this kind of feeling like a Palmyra, palm grove, and I think this is in the UAE, this picture, and I mean, we that was our sort of inspiration for it. So we came up with this idea of trying to create these shade structures that I'm just trying to get this to the next page, actually. Yeah, there we go. And these shade structures are used in, you know, there's about 60 or 70 of them in the spaces, and they naturally shade these streets. I don't know if you can see all that as well. And they move as well with the wind. So working with landscape, in mind, and landscape architects in mind, we created these movable shade structures. They're very light, and they create the streets are able, you're able to walk through them now in these shaded spaces like this in Expo. So I think this has been a successful marriage of architecture and landscape together, and walkable spaces, and hopefully this will become a livable city once it's all finished. But that's our key idea, to make all these different buildings, break them up, make streets in between them, and make them become special human scaled spaces.
It works really well,
Fantastic.
actually, Simon. I've walked through it. It's
Ah,
really
good. Oh, you've seen it, right? Great.
well. Yeah, I've been working on the Opportunity Pavilion.
Ah, right. Okay, great.
So
Oh, good. Yeah. Well, I mean, we, having to deal with a budget that's very, very restricted and tight, and make these things very light. So, our structural engineer, and this is the point you were saying, Camelia, about everyone working together. The structural engineer here, a guy called Steve Webb, he really helped to get my vision of these structures, to make them really light and to make them move as well. He worked out this mechanism of the joint. And so as a landscape architect who would be part of this, you're trying to encourage people all to work together and work as a group to make this result. So I'm really glad you like it. You're there. It's been a difficult process.
actually very atmospheric.
Lovely. Great.
Yeah.
They look lovely.
Great. Well, when we started it, someone said they looked like something in Singapore, at the Marina Base.
Yeah.
And so I said, well, it's okay. There's lots of shapes like that.
No, they
But
have
I
their
think
own identity. I think they do.
Yeah, those things
I
have
think
their
they
own
do.
identity. Great. Yeah, but it's
Yeah.
the patterns and the shade on the street, and
But that's actually also a very Islamic design
yeah,
base.
yeah.
So I understood the intention. Like, I really got that when.
Great. Yeah, I was just trying to find a shaded one here. Yeah, that's great if you're getting that and you're enjoying that. But I think it's interesting at expos. There are lots and lots of key, big spaces, and what we try to do is to encourage a more Middle Eastern approach of tight streets. I mean, what I love is the Bastakir, but I love old souks and Moroccan cities and things like this, and you get all these, the sikas. It's a lovely characteristic of the Middle East, and it's just, once you get a little bit of shading and you get some nice tight streets, you get this natural shade. And one of the last things I'd say is, what struck me most, which was so nice, was just hearing bird song in streets. When we were doing the Gate Village in Dubai, in the Dubai International Finance Center, we hardly had any planting or hardly much water. But as soon as you provided a place for birds to come in, it was absolutely lovely. So it's I really have enjoyed working on this with everyone.
There's actually another great aspect to Expo, which is that Bulent, the landscape architect who's working for the nursery, and he's working on the landscape for the common areas at Expo, they've done a fantastic job of using indigenous plants.
Yes.
Plants throughout the project.
Yeah.
And actually, it's really, again, I'm about to go, I think probably next week, just to go and see it all coming to fruition, because for me personally, it's very exciting to see the real use of indigenous plants in a kind of urban context.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Well, it was it was a challenge. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Great. It was very, very enjoyable.
Great. This was a great example. Really.
I'll stop sharing and move it on to someone else.
Thank you, Simon. We've expressed a lot of, I wouldn't say frustration, but things that we would like to improve and see, enhanced, as especially for the next generations to come. So, Sam, what do you think are some of the essential steps that cities are supposed to take in order to future-proof our cities when it comes to landscape architecture?
Well, I guess climate is one of the key things we need to consider in all of what we do for the future. I think in terms of creating landscapes that can adapt, we need to facilitate that by giving them the opportunity to do so as we in the design process. One of the things I just wanted to show you was, this is an interesting project. We were called in after a housing development in London again had been designed with the car in mind, and we came up with this visual to say, well, it doesn't actually have to be about vehicles, it could be about people. So we managed to take the parking off the street, put that under the building, which was our job to challenge what had been done. But in doing so, what we quickly understood is that the street, this is a cross section here of a typical street. The street doesn't actually belong to vehicles, really. It belongs to all of the services that go on underneath it. So the street actually is a conduit for all of those things that buildings plug into. So sewer, water, gas, electricity, all of those things have their own life. So a bit like fungi and how fungi sort of rule the world in an underground sort of sense, and fungi connects everything to each other. All of the infrastructure that connects buildings to each other is in the street. So what we had to do was model the underground of the street in 3D and Revit to then understand where we could put the infrastructure for people and for nature. So for us, that was a really good process of understanding all of us working together and getting this sort of vision of the future, which is this one here, how we could achieve that together. And we just need to make space and allocate space for this to happen. So that was working around how the underground could change, if you like, to accommodate that. The other one is just in terms of an easier one, I guess, for us is the choice of planting. So at the Chelsea Flower Show last year, we did a garden to represent Greater Manchester, the local authorities of Greater Manchester. So we were looking at resilience in 4 different typologies of planting. One is in the urban environment, so a very hard landscape environment. One is in the parks and landscapes of Manchester. The other was in remediation areas of brownfield and sites that were industrial sites, and now they're coming back and regrowing naturally. And the other one was facades for rainwater gardens, for how we accommodate water and planting. So we had 4 different zones of planting. We managed to get a silver medal for our first garden at Chelsea, which was, I think, quite an achievement. We had quite a small budget. We had a very complicated team. But for us, all of these plants have since gone back to Manchester and have all gone to different volunteer-led parks and gardens around Manchester. So it's only a small thing, but it's a contribution, if you like, to enable people to understand that from the plants we use, there are edible plants, there are plants that are going to remediate the soil, there are plants that are good for nature and biodiversity, and there are plants that can be flooded and then recover and be back to normal again when the water subsides. So this is a very small example of something that we've done. But I think first and foremost, understand the processes, whether it's the natural process or the building process that we all have to go through, and sort of all work together as best we can to achieve that.
That's great. How about urban farming?
Well, urban farming, yeah, that's something that is becoming, I think, more considered in terms of its opportunity in London. We're working on a number of projects. We're working on one next to Waterloo Station, Elizabeth House, which is, I think it's about 1.5 acres of garden or farm that will be on top of the building. And I think Kate, who's in the studio here with me today, the way in which that was understood was how many pret-a-manger salad boxes that farm could create in a day. And so we're going into the thousands. So there's a way in which you can include for and provide for people in the urban environment. And in London we have the value and merit of a temperate climate, so we do have more rain than many other places in the world. But at the same time, we're also changing. I guess the one thing with the equator, you have a more constant sort of series of temperatures, perhaps not always what you want. But in the UK, we are moving a degree further to the south, if you like, in terms of our temperate range. So we are having to accommodate that by planting plants that are going to be able to survive in another degree south of where we're actually planting them now. So that all of those things we need to consider when we're choosing plants for the future, to make sure they outlive all of us and our grandchildren.
Definitely. Thank you for that. Thank you, everyone. I feel like maybe we have around like 5 minutes left, so I'll take a couple of questions from the audience. I have one question here with regards to vertical landscaping. So it says, does it affect building structure? I presume it does, and the materials chosen. And what are your thoughts basically on vertical landscaping as well?
Very difficult.
Very
difficult. It sounds great, but you've got to get someone in there to maintain it all the time. But it's but I'll leave this to the landscape architects.
I think it's important to always make sure that you are working with the architect to understand the structure of the building, and the type of system you use is in, you know, is the main factor. But you know, the you know, obviously the effects that it can have positively on the environment in an urban landscape is huge. So, you know, it's great to see that it's happening worldwide. But also, you know, I think if you look at there's in Singapore, and I mean all over the world now, architects are designing these incredible buildings where you know, they're all 40 maybe 50 stories high, and you've got trees on the balconies, and you've got light. And I think again it's back to making sure that people can grow their own food, that they can have their connection to, you know, nature. But technically it's not the easiest thing to do.
It's very difficult. Maintenance, resource heavy, takes a lot of water. I think that's why Singapore is such a great example, because it really works there, and in Kuala Lumpur. I think in London it's incredibly difficult, and I would say with fire regulations as they are, it's impossible really, because the combustible nature of organic material prevents you from having a habitable building with a vegetated wall. So, you know, I think in Singapore, brilliant, because it's the right climate. I mean, just like, it's the right place for the right thing, I think.
It's prevalent in Australia. I mean, our guys have done a lot of stuff in Oz with it as well. I think I've yet to see it done well in the UAE. I think there's some examples where it's done okay, like the Novotel on Sheikh Zayed Road in Dubai. It's been, I think it's really the system. I think, like you said, they haven't established a system here yet that is going to give you the enough planting medium that it's protected from the heat. That's the main thing. I think it's very difficult to get that, and you need lots of water to do that. And I think it does have a big knock-on effect to the structure and all that kind of stuff, and your water system and everything. So I think Camelia talked about earlier on as well, having it there from the beginning, and having the people, especially involved from the very beginning of an architectural design, is really key to it.
Sam's point of, you know, again, it's about where you are in the world as to whether that landscape is relevant and can work. So, you know, let's be honest, vertical here is, I don't think, a very clever use of planting or resources, and it's actually a big waste in terms of sustainability.
That's the interesting thing, is that we're actually smart about the decisions, you know, made, and you know, when something that is generally green or sustainable in certain part of the world doesn't have to be in the other. And this is where, you know, we need to be careful about these assumptions made. Definitely. One more question, I think, to Camelia, since it's in the UAE, or even Rowan, maybe. What is the most unique or unusual plant you've used in the UAE? And what are the horticultural practices used to ensure its survival?
Oh,
Camelia's there to steal this one.
Rowan, go for it.
That's a difficult one. Well, this came from our landscape team at Sharjah, so.
Tough one, sure. Tough one. Look, I can't really speak to really interesting species. I think I've done a lot of public ground projects where a lot of the species have been kind of bulletproof, and that's the reason they've been selected. But I think Camelia is probably a better place. She's probably done some more interesting stuff than we have. But we're always trying to challenge ourselves to really look at some interesting stuff.
If I'm really honest with you, it's indigenous plants that is the biggest test in every way, because number one, it's understanding how they should be planted, because a lot of them, if they're overwatered, will overseed and therefore just go absolutely crazy. Maintenance is a huge issue because actually no one really knows how to maintain them yet. So I'm learning as I go on Koa canvas, for example. But also, you know, you'll have, like I said before, I mentioned there are species that might actually just die off in your landscape and or look dead. And then, of course, the maintenance crew will come in and remove them. But actually, they need to be left so that they can seed, and then they'll come back the next year, because it is a plant that should be just left to its own devices, very much so in a desert setting, because it's about survival. So I honestly think, you know, that's been personally my biggest challenge, and is still my biggest challenge, because I'm learning constantly.
Yeah. I mean, we need to constantly learn and evolve, right? That's definitely. What's that one on the bottom right, I think?
Oh, that's from South Africa, I think.
Yeah, I was just going to put these up because I was expecting one of you wonderful landscape specialists to tell me that it was wrong. But I like very much that orange flower it's got.
We've got them all the way along our main road in Albarari.
Right.
And when they flower, and I've used them also in our woodland themed garden.
Yeah, but it is a South African. It's a South African. Yeah, right. Yeah.
But and I don't know how it's happened, but I went trekking in Hatta, and there's one area that we found at the bottom of this wadi where the water clearly comes out as well, because they've concreted some of it and kind of created a bit of a channel, where there's loads of them just naturally grown, and they look very old. They look like
they look lovely, don't they?
Yeah, they're gorgeous.
Yeah, very, you know, but
we're working on a master plan in northwest Saudi Arabia. It's probably sensitively put, and there there's a big altitude difference between where we normally work and where this place is at, and there's some really interesting fauna up there that we're looking to hopefully replicate or use that with.
Have you seen the almond trees?
Yes, the purple.
Yes. Yeah, because I went trekking really in Saudi. It was amazing. So I was like, oh my God, it looked like cherry trees. I was like, what is this?
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah.
That's probably you might
It doesn't grow in the UAE?
No, because you need the big temperature. It might in the mountains, to be honest.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because you need the temperature changes.
I see. Well, I personally learned a lot tonight, so thank you all. Is there anyone would like to have any last thing to say? Final statements?
Can I just say, guys, I think from my point of view, I'm not an Emirati. I'm not from the Middle East. I'm from Ireland, and I actually really have always been, in my 8 years here, been really excited by the challenge of landscaping here, or being a landscape architect here, and also the power for it to be a place for a thing for change, you know. And I think that's something that we're seeing throughout the region at the moment. I think it's a really powerful driver for change. Landscape is the place that people meet. It has the power to re-educate, and community says. I mean, it's not always about trees, but it's, you know, it really is a powerful tool for change in the Middle East, especially at the moment where you see widespread development and social change right across the region. I think it's a really powerful thing to be involved in, and I'm very honored to be. So, yeah, that's my last word.
I would say, you know, to everyone that, you know, nature is good for the soul, and the more time you spend in it, the better you're going to feel, especially now during these, you know, times. Getting your children involved, you know, whether that's growing vegetables in your garden, whether it's just grounding yourself and taking your shoes off and putting your feet in the grass or on the beach, But just get out there, and you know, it really is the best de-stressor in the world.
Yeah, and I just thank you very much for the opportunity today. But I made mention of fungi. I just would like to recommend an amazing book, if you have time over the break, called Entangled Life, and it's pretty much it's known as the Wood Wide Web. So it's really how the substructure of the world, soil and everything that's in it, is the thing that connects us all, and is fundamental to the well-being of the earth. So look after the soil, is what I'd say.
Thank you for the recommendation. Great. Simon?
Oh yes. Well, I just everyone else has said a fantastic summary. I just create streets, make lovely streets for people to walk in. That's what the challenge should be, and that's how I'd sign off. I would say that's my remit.
Yeah, and also probably a request from one of our attendees: wild play for adults.
Yes.
As well.
Yeah, that's a great statement. That fantastic, and why not?
Yeah,
I'll play for adults. Why not? Yeah.
Yeah, go try climb a tree. Just don't fall out.
No cars, more people, more plants.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, guys. It's a privilege to do this with you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Nice to see you.
Yeah.
Have a good holiday.
Yeah,
Yes.
happy holidays.
Christmas and Happy New Year.